Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, made tackling domestic and sexual abuse one of her priorities when she entered Downing Street. But women's refuges say they will be forced to close if the government's new funding proposals are implemented. Lizzie has been to a refuge to talk to women there and hear their stories.
One particular day it was a look, and he said something to me like, you know, as long as you live in these four walls, you belong to me. And it just, that was the trigger, and it was the smile on his face. And I just realised I can't stay here.
It's estimated that 1.2 million women experienced domestic abuse in the last year. There are 305 women's refuges in England and Wales. Natalie and her son were able to escape to one of them.
I felt probably liberated, free. This person didn't know where I was.
So how bad did it get?
At the height, he held a gun to me, so that's how deep it was. So if I'd not got away, for me personally, I don't know if I'd be here. For my son, he could have lost a mother. But I think more importantly is for my son, and what was important for me is I knew that this man wasn't a role model for my son. I didn't want my son to grow up and think that that was okay.
What are you thinking when someone is holding a gun to your head?
I don't know. Don't know.
So how many women do you have in here?
We have 12 women, but obviously those women can have children, usually 2 or 3. There could be pregnant women, babies as well.
So it can be quite busy.
You're very busy, yep.
Aside from charity, refuges like this one in North London receive most of their funding through local councils. But since 2010, that funding has been under pressure, with refuges being asked to do more for less.
How difficult is it at the moment? Has it got worse?
Absolutely. We are seeing more risk, more trauma, and we're seeing an increasing number of referrals for every single vacancy which we have, that many families, they can't find a space on the first occasion and they don't try again, and they're still suffering.
And that means they're going back to potentially violent, even life-threatening situations?
Absolutely, yes.
I would be dead. I would seriously be dead. He was kicking me around the flat.
After years of abuse, Sarah was offered a place in a refuge following a particularly brutal attack.
When I went to my room, this is the first time when I felt safe and I felt happy. I felt like things gonna be okay, that it's safe. My son saw everything, absolutely everything. He saw all my bruises and everything because all my face was bruised. And he used to touch it and he would say, "Oh, we're happy now, we're safe now. It's nice here," he would say.
"It's frightfully nice of you, Al, but no."
Earlier this year, the government launched a consultation on a bill to make domestic abuse a specific offence in law. But women's groups say the issue of funding has not been addressed, and as a result, services are suffering.
We need refuges because they give women a second chance and children a second chance. And if they don't have them, then what else are they going to do? Where else can they go? How can you start a new life? You know, you can't do that if you don't have somewhere to go.
Well, joining us here in the studio to discuss the funding issues around women's refuges is Kevin Hollinrake, Conservative MP, who is on the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, which is in charge of refuge funding, and Mary Mason, CEO of Solace Women's Aid, a charity which runs refuges across London. We did ask the government for a minister, but no one was available. Welcome to both of you. Mary, first of all, we know domestic abuse is a complicated issue. It cuts across all sorts of agencies, housing, immigration, mental health and so on. Just just explain for us what your organisation does?
So we provide support for women and children who are fleeing domestic abuse, basically. We also run services, rape crisis services for women who've experienced sexual abuse. So we run we do some work with perpetrators of abuse as well, prevention. So we run quite a complex network of services for women and children, some men who've experienced abuse.
Now, the government has promised to pump in more money into refuges or to help domestic violence, but you have said in the past that you've had to turn women and children away. Why?
So we're still turning women and children away from our services. We're turning women and children away from our refuge services because there are not enough spaces. So on any one day, about a third of women who require spaces are turned away from them. In our other services, for example, therapeutic services, counselling services, we have closed waiting lists because we don't have enough resources in order to support the numbers who are coming through. One of the issues is that we've had increased reporting of domestic abuse and sexual abuse, which is positive and has been led by some of the media information about the different campaigns have led to increased reporting, and we just do not have the resources in order to support those women and children coming forward.
Right. Are you going to put more resources in to meet that demand?
Yeah, there is more money going in, and this is not about cuts. This is about redistribution of the monies to make it more applicable and more and fairer in terms of how these services are delivered.
How are you redistributing the money?
Well, it's going to be at local authority level rather than at national level, but the government's absolutely committed to providing solutions. This is about more demand, more referrals, as it said on your clip, but the government's absolutely committed to making sure no women are turned away by 2020. But this is not about cuts, it's about reshaping the service and reshaping where the money goes.
Right, but in the end, if people can't get into the refuges, then it comes to the same thing.
Huge demand. I mean, we're seeing 12,000 women every year and 12,000 children every year who want to flee domestic abuse.
Do you accept this redistributing of funding that's going to make it better for women?
One of the major issues is that there's a whole complex issue around funding, which is about supported accommodation, of which refuge services is just 1%. Most supported accommodation is for the elderly and people with long-term disabilities, and we've been wrapped up in the solution to that funding where housing benefit is being moved to universal credit. All sounds very technical, but the issue is a real-life issue. We should be stepping outside of supported accommodation funding, and we should look at domestic abuse funding as a national priority in terms of particularly supporting women and children to flee and to find a safe space.
Right.
And that can only happen through refuges, right. And we have no commitment from government to do that.
Right, so you're failing these women, Kevin Hollinrake, because actually Theresa May stood on the steps of Downing Street and said she was going to tackle the burning injustices, and she made domestic violences one of the key tenets. Well, you're not, are you?
No, I don't accept that. We're changing the legislation so it's easier to prosecute somebody for domestic abuse and easier to follow that through, so the legislation has been simplified. Also, the resources are not being cut. That is clear, and Mary accepts that position. So the money is going to be delegated to local authorities. The concern is...
Well, hang on, does Mary... Do you accept that?
No, I don't accept that, because it's the local authorities who will be making a decision about whether they cut services or not. And we already know local authorities are cutting services. And we also know that if the funding changes so that housing benefit is removed from refuges, then there will be about a third of refuges will become non-viable.
Right. Are you ring-fencing this money?
The money has been ring-fenced. That's the point. The money will be ring-fenced at local authority level.
So local authorities will be forced, will they?
Absolutely.
They'll be legally obliged
to
use that money. Will that not make a difference?
No, because already 10% of refuges are not funded through local authorities. So we already are short of refuge spaces. Another 10% are likely to be cut because they're not already funded. And also, we have also seen ring fences being put in place and removed. And over the last 10 years, we had supported accommodation, ring fenced. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, removed. So there's no consistency, and also local authority funding for refuges. A lot of local authorities are making the decision that it's not a priority because the refuge does not meet the needs of women who are already living in their area. Now, the problem is that most women have to leave the area in order to be safe.
Right.
So they do not stay in their local authority area, and so local authorities are saying that's not our priority.
You don't seem to understand this issue.
No, I understand it perfectly. We looked at this on the Select Committee. We absolutely made the point that certainly we need to make make sure there's a ring fence in place, which there is a ring fence in place.
Yes, but you've just heard Mary explain why that's not going to be enough.
But Mary is worried about that, but accepts there is a ring fence in place, and that needs to stay in place. We also need oversight arrangements so that if you're a victim of domestic abuse, you may want to move far away from where you live, and we need to make sure local authorities in that receiving area do provide the service wherever that person comes from.
Right, you have some expertise in this area, don't you, Thang? Tell us about your experience and what you think of the government's proposals and changing the funding.
Well, I spent the 26 years before becoming an MP working in the domestic violence sector, and latterly in the last 10 years working with perpetrators, in fact. But I think Kevin has just made the case for a national funding strategy, I'm afraid, Kevin, for refugees, because people do have to flee, people have to move areas, and a local authority that they have to flee to, the one that they feel safe in, may not recognise their needs adequately. And also because, as Mary says, there's perpetrator programmes as well need to be funded. And, I declare an interest. That was where I worked, as I said, in the 10 years before I became an MP. But I think that also needs to be taken into consideration, and that funding must not compete with the funding for women's refugees. But there's so many gaps in the provision of adequate, safe, effective perpetrator programmes that I think that has to be taken into consideration as well. And I urge all my colleagues in the domestic violence sector to take part in the government consultation and let the government know how you feel before the 31st of May.
Will you change and will you listen to what's being said
Absolutely.
here?
This is a consultation that's happening right now. So people do have concerns. We had concerns as a select committee, and we did say that there are real concerns about people out of area particularly, which Tanam was referring to right then. So absolutely people should submit their feelings to the consultation and make sure that the government will listen, and I believe will act if this new provision is not going to be fit for purpose.
Right, well, we just heard Mary say earlier that women and children are being turned away now. If that funding change goes through, this redistribution that Kevin talks about, will you have to turn away more women and children?
Yeah, we reckon that we'll have to turn away about a third of the women and children who currently come in. We're already turning away a third of those who want to come in. The problem is that the government is treating domestic violence refugees in the same way as they're treating the whole range of supported accommodation services. They need to take domestic violence refugees out of that and look at the need of women and children who are fleeing domestic abuse and the need for refugees alongside other provision for domestic abuse.
Will you take it out of that general, generic grouping of support?
There's two things that need to happen. Absolutely. It's ring-fence the money, so this money is dedicated to solving the problems.
But will you actually take it out of that group so it's not then lost? Well, so women aren't turned away.
That's ultimately down to the government to decide. I'm not a government minister, but I think there are real concerns about the national situation, and this is what we said in the Select Committee. Everybody should get support wherever they have suffered domestic abuse.
But they're not. We've established that. We've established that they're not, because Women's Aid have said 1 in 5 of all referrals were declined due to lack of space in the refuge.
And we need to put more money in. And we're putting more money in. That's absolutely right. But in terms of where this consultation is moving, we need to make sure that support is there wherever you've suffered abuse and wherever you go to try and find help.
All right. Thank you both for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.